Isn't it?
It goes forever. What's the computer say? 6:30. This is a minute behind. Okay.
Just might write that down. I'm gonna talk to somebody about that. What's one to do?
Welcome, everyone, to the October 21st meeting of the Lawrence Douglas County Metropolitan Planning Commission. We're going to be meeting both tonight and Wednesday, so we only have a couple of items on the agenda now for this evening, but first we have to go through some general business items. So first is whether everyone have a look at the meeting minutes from September 25th. Any corrections, additions, changes, motions?
Move that we approve it.
Moved by Commissioner Sinclair, seconded by Commissioner Carter. All those in favor of approving the minutes? 10-0. Are there any committee reports from over the last month? Okay, seeing none. Any written communications from the public for tonight that haven't made it into the packet?
No, sir.
None. Any written communications from staff, planning commissioners, or other commissioners?
No, sir.
None. Any written action or waiver requests or determinations made by the city engineer?
Nope.
Any disclosure of ex parte communications on any of the items on the agenda this evening?
Not officially ex parte, but I do live in the neighborhood adjacent to the first item on the agenda and have been generally party to conversations around the neighborhood about that project.
Okay. Any others? Okay, seeing none. Any abstentions on any item tonight? Good, don't see any. This time we open the meeting to general public comment. Any members of the public that wish to comment for up to 3 minutes on any item not on tonight's agenda or on Wednesday night's agenda, feel free to come up to the podium. Okay, seeing none. That brings us to item number 1, which is to consider approving a preliminary plat for Baysinger Island located at 1827 Louisiana Street.
Good evening. My name is Kyle Kobe. I'm with the Planning Department. This is the Baysinger Island Preliminary Plat. The property is approximately 0.172 acres. It's located at the northwest corner of the intersection of West 19th Street and Louisiana Street. You can see it on the slide here. The property has never been platted, and in order to pull building permits, platting is a requirement. There is an existing non-conforming use on the site. The current proposal proposes to change that use, but they will not be exceeding the customer service area established with that prior use. So a change of zoning is not required with this project. The surrounding area is primarily residential in nature. The Veterans Park is directly across the street to the east, and Lawrence High School is across the street to the south. The rest of the properties surrounding this are residential in nature. The project proposes a lot that's equal to the parcel that currently exists on the site. It's not proposing to expand the lot lines. There are utilities, as you can see on the plans here, that are noted along the southern lot line. There's another pedestrian easement that will be dedicated with the final plat, and there is a site plan application that's on file right now to account for some of the other issues on the site. The staff recommends approval of the Baysinger Island preliminary plat, and I'm ready to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Kyle. There may be some, but first, is the applicant here? And if so, would you like to comment?
I'm here.
If you'd please sign in and state your name.
Sure thing. My name is Matt Baysinger, hence Baysinger Island. Wanted to have some fun with the name. Yeah, we've been working on this project for, theoretically, for probably a little over a year now, working with Taylor Petrin with 1900 Barker, who has done an amazing job of turning around that property at 19th and Barker into a bakery that I think has helped to revitalize that neighborhood that I lived in when we did that project. We're tremendously excited about the proximity to Lawrence High School, excited about being at a busy corner, excited about taking what we believe to have been a very rundown laundromat and turning it into something that creates life and goodness and creates a wonderful place for both students, youth, as well as adults to hang out and eat tasty treats.
All right, thank you. This is a non-public agenda item, but as is our practice, we generally open the floor for comments from the public. If anyone has any comments or thoughts about this particular proposal, feel free to come up to the podium. All right, seeing none, we'll bring it back up to the commission. Any discussion, questions for the applicant or staff? Okay. Commissioner Sands.
I'll just say that when I was a student, I used that laundromat, so I'm happy that it's going to be something that brings neighborhood commercial to that area, and hopefully we see more projects like this, so I'm in full support of it.
Commissioner
I can just
Ashworth.
say the general comments I've been hearing around the neighborhood are very positive.
Any other comments or questions? Motion?
When I was a student at Lawrence High, I would have liked something like that 25 years ago. So my student would also like that, but he has celiac disease, so he probably won't be either.
We'll work on some gluten-free options.
Commissioner Sands.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the preliminary plat for Baysinger Island located at 1827 Louisiana Street, based upon the findings of fact found by the staff report.
Have a second? Seconded by Commissioner Ashworth. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Passes 10-0. Thank you. Brings- Second item tonight is to consider rescinding a minimum maintenance road designation for a portion of North 100 Road in Marion Township.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Ryan Umberger. I'm a transportation planning intern with the Lawrence Douglas County Metropolitan Planning Organization. The item before you this evening is MM 190001. It's a request by the Board of Highway Commissioners of Marion Township to rescind a minimum maintenance designation on a section of North 100 Road from 600 East to 700 East. To begin, I'll give you some background on minimum maintenance road and get you oriented to the subject roadway's location. Minimum maintenance roads are public roadways which are used very infrequently and therefore do not need to be maintained to normal road standards. In these situations, the Kansas legislature allows the township to have it declared minimum maintenance. This allows the township to reduce the frequency of upkeep on the road and removes liability should someone travel down it and suffer damage to their vehicle. The item considers discontinuing that designation and returning full maintenance status to the stretch of North 100 Road, which is located in southwest Douglas County. You can see its location in the yellow circle on the board. The process to label a roadway as a minimum maintenance comes from Kansas Statute 685102. Reversing the designation follows that same procedure. Douglas County effectively follows through 4 steps. First, the township chooses to proceed with the process of reversing the minimum maintenance designation. The Board of Highway Commissioners of Marion Township sends notices to adjacent landowners and holds a public hearing where a recommendation can be made to the County Commission. The County Commission reviews the township's recommendation and seeks a recommendation from the Planning Commission. That's where you guys come in. The Planning Commission, it's your responsibility to review the request and prepare a recommendation to be forwarded to the County Commission. Finally, the County Commission will review your recommendation, hold a hearing, and take action based on the previous process. Should the County Commission decide to rescind the designation, Marion Township will remove existing signs once the roadway has been improved to the regular maintenance standard, and it will be open like any other road. In the case before you, a property owner submitted a request to the township who chose to proceed with the process. The County Commission voted to receive the item and has requested a recommendation from the Planning Commission, where it's at in the process today. The township was agreeable to bringing the road to a regular maintenance standard because the road is already in decent shape and the cost to make the necessary improvements are relatively minor. For some context, there are roughly 21 miles of minimum maintenance roads in Douglas County. 8 1/4 or 38% of those are roadways within Marion Township. The proposed change removes that designation from 2,083 feet of a segment of North 100 Road. Staff recommends the Planning Commission approve the request, MM 190001, and forward this recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners. I'll stand for any questions if you have them.
Thank you. Don't know if there will be any, but is there an applicant on this? It's
Can
the
you
county.
repeat that?
Is there an applicant? The applicant would be the homeowner that made their first request, right? Or is it the township?
The homeowner made the request to the township, from what I understand.
Okay. All right. Any questions for staff? Okay. Thanks.
Thanks.
Is the homeowner here? Don't see them. We open this item up to public comments. If you'd like to comment on this, please come to the podium, sign your name. Please state your name clearly so we can hear it. And please limit your comments to about 3 minutes.
Sorry, it took me a minute to write all that. I'm Geraldine Kaufmann, and I live at 646 North 100 Road. I own the land, part of the land, right to the east of the stretch that you see marked on the map. I did attend the Marion Township meeting. I just want to express to you what I heard the gentleman say was that they would take the signs down. To the east of the stretch that you're considering, and if you go on to the east, I don't know if any of you have been out there and taken a drive down the road, but it's absolutely terrible. I'm a fifth-generation owner of that property. So thank you, that's very helpful. Yeah, I have, and if I point, you don't have, yeah, keep it, yes, here we go. Okay, this is the Globe Quarry. This is where I'm fifth generation owner of the corner. This is the area in yellow that's under consideration. And this area that I'm pointing to now isn't passable. So many parts of the year, and I haven't been down there recently, but I'm going to say that it probably, with all the rain we've had, the township only goes through there about once a year. So this is the corner, the edge of the property. So if people start going down this road, there's a double gate right here, and they're going to be turning into my property to turn around. So, and they can't really turn right there unless they have a small vehicle. So I don't know what we're going to do if we open it here to control the traffic. And I brought this up at the Marion Springs Township meeting as well, not just here. So I just bring that point to you that I'm not, these are my neighbors, I'm not terribly opposed to their suggestion of opening this up, but I don't know what you're going to do with people that go down that road because they can't go on through many parts of the year. So that's the point that I wanted to make. I don't know, I'm assuming Marion Township will be putting up new signage, but unless they have four-wheel vehicle, they, mark my word, they can't make it through parts of the year. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
Unless someone has questions.
Okay. There might be questions. Any other public comment? All right, seeing none, we'll bring it back up to the commission. Any questions?
Why is it you're looking at me?
Because you looked like you had a question. Commissioner Willie.
So our fire department, Willow Springs Fire Department, just recently took over the eastern portion of Marion Township last couple of years. And these minimum maintenance roads, we generally know where they are. We generally kind of keep them in mind. That doesn't mean you don't forget in the heat of the moment and start down a road and think, oh, I can't take a tender or an engine down this road. So certainly from my perspective, the more maintained roads we have, the better. But to your point about that it's not passable all the way through is something that I think the Marion Township Board ought to take a look at. And certainly they would need to put some kind of signage to that effect, maybe even closer up on the road. But we can't speak to that for them. But I assume that they must have some. I keep looking at you because you brought this point up, and I think it's well brought up. They must have some intention of marking that so that people aren't trying to go past where this minimum maintenance this minimum maintenance would end. I don't think that's really a question exactly, but I think even just for getting to grass fires and things like that, even if there aren't homes or the rest of that stretch, it's really helpful to have as much maintained road if the township is willing to do it and has the tax money to do it. But I think maybe that next step is then they'll have to look at how to get through that creek crossing that's just to the east of there.
Any other comments or questions? Commissioner Sands?
Just maybe a question for staff. When it does come time to apply signage, would that be a county responsibility, or is that do they delegate that down to the township?
That's the responsibility of the township.
Okay. Good to know.
And then who enforces that to make sure the proper signage is there?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Scott, do you?
I don't. These are pretty rare instances for us, but it appears to be primarily a township issue. And as Ryan mentioned, it's for the purpose of reducing liability to that township. So they have a vested interest, I think, to make sure it's signed appropriately. I also think that there's a practical issue of turnaround and making sure someone doesn't get too deep onto a road that's partially open, partially minimum maintenance. I have driven on a few of these, and if it's not signed appropriately, even if it is, you might find yourself in sort of a pickle if you're not properly equipped, or the ditches are steep, or you just don't have the turnaround. So, perhaps in your comments to the county commission to just highlight a couple of these factors and comments on both sides might be helpful for the last discussion in the process, which is with the county commission.
Ms. Kaufmann, I have a question. Since you live on this road, who actually drives down this road now?
Well, there will be a great parade of hunters here soon. I'll be out checking cattle at night, and I'll see people try to go down this road in their cars, and I'm like, because they get the county line, we're just 1 mile north of the Douglas-Franklin County line, and they get confused what road they're on. So, and otherwise, it's mainly local traffic through there.
Does the area in red actually go anyplace?
Does the red actually go any place? Is that
Yeah,
your
where does
question,
it,
sir?
where does that road actually go?
It ends up, it goes all the way through. I mean, there's a low water bridge right here where it turns, and there's a curve here, and then the bridge is, the low water part is not straight. I mean, it curves and then goes back, and then there's a pretty steep hill right here. Ryan, you probably have been out there, that goes up, and then you go down, and then it goes all the way through. I mean, you have exit clear over on the other side of 100 Road.
Would you have any suggestions to the township as to what kind of signs?
Well, I think the sign, and this is what I told them at Marion Township meeting, is the sign can't go here. The signage has to go, right now, it's down, let me think where it is. The first sign is down in here. But I'm trying to remember, there's one right past the Milburn home right here that says something about about the condition of the road. And if I remember, there's another one right here. But to me, the sign needs to come out, clear out, so they don't even go down 100 Road. Particularly if Mr. Milburn's intent is to sell or to have one of his children or someone to put in a home here, I would think the signage should go out right at the corner. That's what I suggested to the Marion Township Board.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Commissioner Strucco.
What was the response from the township at the meeting when you made
It
this?
was positive.
Okay. To doing something about the signage at that point?
Yes,
Okay.
it was positive. And there were, I have to say, I'm surprised at that meeting, there were a lot of landowners there. They were concerned about the condition of this road because what one of the trustees said was that they only go through this once a year with their maintenance equipment, which in my opinion isn't enough, but I think they shared with us that that's what they're required to do in terms of minimum maintenance, that was the only thing they were required. But it certainly can be very, I don't know if I can get through it right now. The only way I can, and my property is right along here, and this is one of my brothers, but the only way I can get to it now is probably to go all the way around the section and then come in from the east headed west.
Thank you.
Commissioner Willie.
While you're still standing, I have another question. Has there been any discussion with Marion Township about improving the portion to the east of there through that drainage? Or is that something that that would be more expensive than what we're proposing here, but?
I have not heard any of that discussion, nor did I get a sense of that when the landowners were at that meeting. I didn't hear any commitment to that.
Thank you very much.
And this is pretty much broken up, this concrete to make the lower water bridge here it's pretty, the concrete over time is pretty broken up, so it's in pretty bad shape.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Senior Assistant City Attorney Randy Larkin has a comment on the signs.
This is a county issue. Typically, regarding signs, traffic signs, there's not a lot of discretion that the township would have. They're going to be required to basically follow the manual of the Uniform Traffic Control Devices as to where these signs are going to be put up and what they have to put up. So just to let you guys know that typically cities, counties don't have a lot of discretion. If they do, if they violate the discretion, that may create extra liability for themselves.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Any motions? Commissioner Strucco?
I move that we recommend approval of the request to rescind the minimum maintenance designation on North 100 Road. and forward that recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners.
Is there a second? Commissioner Willie? We have a first and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Passes 10-0. Please let the county know what you're thinking about this too when it comes up there. Brings us to item number 3, consider approving a special use permit for the adaptive reuse of designated historic property at 1307 Massachusetts Street.
Hello again, Kyle Covey with the Planning Department. So I just want to start off by going through the timeline. This is a little bit different than the standard special use permit that comes through here. These projects are required to be reviewed in a specific sequence. The first one is the Historic Resources Commission reviews it, sends it to the Planning Commission, who then forwards their recommendation on to the City Commission. The Planning Commission's role is outlined here and is outlined in your staff report, is for the most part the same as a standard special use permit, with the exception that you receive that recommendation from the Historic Resources Commission, and you just incorporate that into your considerations. And speaking of the Historic Resources Commission, they discussed this item at their regular meeting this past Thursday, October 17th. They voted unanimously to approve the project based both on the Secretary of the Interior standards and the criteria established in Section 20-501. So just transitioning over to a little bit of the background of the property. There is a special use permit on the site right now, SUP 030307, that was also for an adaptive reuse, and it is the document that authorized the current use on the site, which is it's a small event space. As previously noted, this is a historically listed property. It is listed on the national, state, and the local registry. It is also in the Oriad Neighborhood Overlay District, though there are no proposed physical changes to the site right now, so it doesn't really trigger any of the items within that overlay. The property is surrounded mostly by residential uses to the east, south, and west, and then commercial to the north, and then just outside of the range of these images is South Park. So just transitioning over to the application itself, as you can see from this handy diagram that I have here, the designated historic properties are can have a adaptive reuse established on them in RM32 zoning districts via special use permit. These are the proposed uses for the site, the uses that are proposed as adaptive reuses. And I just want to briefly cover some of the items from the plan itself. The first one is that, as you saw in your staff report, the parking that's in place on the site right now is recommended to be frozen in place. That is permissible with this per section 20-902, which states that that parking for adaptive reuse properties is to be established at the time of the special use itself. This is the table from that plan which outlines the uses on the site. As you can see, the two different columns indicating the two different addresses. Theoretically, the two different uses could exist on the two different addresses at the same time, although most likely, I think that it's safe to say that most likely it would be the same use on the site, but it could be one on one and one on the other one as well. I wanted to highlight this part of the plan just briefly, just because this is the portion of it that states that full compliance with any and all relevant codes and standards will still be required. This is not like a blanket approval of any and all proposals for any one of these uses. This, just like with any other special use permit, is just for the uses themselves. Just in this case, there's more than usual, and it is on a historic property. With that, staff would recommend approval of the special use permit and for the request to the City Commission subject to the conditions listed in the staff report. And I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. There probably will be questions. Is the applicant present?
Yes.
Would you like to speak?
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Went Winter. I'm a partner in the law firm of Stevens and Brand in Lawrence, but I appear before you in my court-appointed capacity as custodian of the LaBuse Chris Fiorino Historical Foundation, Inc. First of all, besides my introduction, let me tell you that we appreciate all the time that staff has worked on this, and we have no recommendations at all for change to the staff recommendations. We think staff is correct in its conditions. Those conditions are satisfactory to us, and we request that the commission approve and concur in staff's recommendation. Let me go backwards in time to give you an explanation about why we're here asking for the potential ability, and I emphasize potential because, as Kyle said, any use of this property to which we may actually move will require which requires any kind of permit must come back at least to the Historic Resources Commission. So we view this as the first and tentative steps toward identifying a use which will stop the march toward insolvency or bankruptcy of this foundation. Let me explain. In the 1980s, a woman named Libby abused Chris Fiorino and her husband, who was a physician, came to town, and I'm going to truncate this to move more quickly. So pardon me if I get some dates not inexact. Came to town and they acquired the John Roberts Castle. And that's the property some people know as the Castle Tea Room that is where indicated. Libby lived there. She resided in the property. She took great pride in its historical nature. She worked to allow the public to come onto and into the property to see it. She did that in a variety of ways, including operating at one point in time a restaurant. Kyle and I were talking about that today. We don't know whether she actually had the land use permits to do that, but she did. And she operated it for teas, literally teas. You could come make reservations and attend a tea in the tea room. And so she utilized it not only for her residents, but as was very important to her, for the public's enjoyment. As time went on, Libby continued to use the property as described. She made plans, as some people do, a lot of people don't, to try to perpetuate her use of the property, including the beneficial use of the citizens of Lawrence and surrounding areas. She did that by having her lawyer create a Kansas not-for-profit corporation known as the Views Chris Fiorino Historical Foundation, Inc. And that historical foundation was specifically designated as a non-for-profit entity under the laws of Kansas and under the Articles of Organization or Articles of Incorporation, which are required to create such an entity. She put in there a clause which is somewhat ambiguous, but best read, it indicates that the purpose of the foundation is to continue the preservation and the use of the Castle Tea Room as an historic property in a way which allows the public to access and see and appreciate the property. It's therefore questionable under law if the property could be sold to someone else for a private residence. Now, I'm not going to tell you that it couldn't be, but generally speaking, we know from the language that Libby used and her lawyers that her desire was to perpetuate the upkeep, the maintenance, and public availability of this wonderful property. Libby then, by her will, provided for a transfer of this property and some other assets to this foundation when she died. She died in about 2004 or 5, and at that point in time, pursuant to her estate plan, the Castle Tea Room and 3 adjoining properties, they were all residential properties that adjoined the castle, all were transferred to this non-for-profit foundation. Additionally, approximately $4 million of cash and investable assets was transferred to the same non-for-profit foundation. It became governed, as it must, by a board of directors, who were primarily her lawyer, her accountant, and some other people, particularly a couple of folks who were involved in the KU School of Architecture. They found themselves then with the stewardship, the requirement to steward this property, and to cut through a lot of discussion that we found in researching the files, they decided that of all the possible uses that this property could be put, that they wanted to continue the use as an events rental venue, a la having teas and other events available for the public. They then proceeded to work with architects to design plans, and over the course of 2 or 3 years, they finished the renovation, which cost about $3 million. The renovation was wonderfully done, and it also was done with a specific intent to continue the use as a small event rental center. They embodied that by, among other things, requesting the then commissions to approve a special use permit, which allowed one and only one use, an events rental center. Correct, Kyle? I think that's the only use which is allowed under the existing special use permit. The renovations they did, as I said, were wonderful. However, they made it more difficult for the property to be utilized for anything else. For example, they installed a wonderful geothermal HVAC system, which, in order to be utilized, requires HVAC equipment to be installed in 2 or 3 of the closets in the second floor bedrooms, thus making it very difficult to convert those bedrooms back into functioning bedrooms. So they then proceeded after the renovation to put into place what they believed to be Libby's direction, use this place for an event rental venue. They hired a full-time manager for the venue. They approved and spent money for marketing, for other staff, and they went down that road for a number of years, operating the Castle Tea Room, and they met with some success. They met with enough success for a number of years to have revenue from the event rental function, which covered the expenses of operation and ownership. As time went on, however, they found that the event rental business became more and more competitive. The tastes of people became different. And then about 2010, 12, the board makeup essentially changed almost totally. And 5 new people went on the board, and they attempted to operate the property as an event rental venue in a profitable manner. Suffice it to say that over time, those efforts failed. And they failed in that the competitive nature of the event rental business here in Lawrence became very difficult for them to be successful. I won't go into, you can imagine the changes that existed in this community about event rental venues, but it became very difficult for them to book events. And to the extent that over the course of the last several years, they found themselves operating at a financial deficit. That is, that the revenue they were able to take in from event rentals was not sufficient to cover the regular operating expenses of maintaining that building. And by the way, you can imagine that the expenses of properly maintaining that building are not insignificant. So they also found that they had a couple folks who resigned from the board, and there were only 3 people on the board when the bylaws required 5, if not 7. They tried to recruit other people. They were not successful in that. So they were operating, attempting to operate the board without a proper lawful number of board members. They also were attempting, of course, to operate it financially, but they only could use it for small event rentals. And they tried quite a number of different things to make it financially feasible, including, I might say, entering into a partnership with Steve Maselli, because they viewed that Steve had the most vibrant event rental and catering business, and if anybody knew how to put events in the castle, it would be Steve. That failed. So they did a number of things to attempt to make this work. And a little more than a year ago, they started thinking, we don't know, it seems like we're out of ideas, including ideas, obviously, to populate the board at a lawful, appropriate size. So in talking about their options, their lawyer identified that there is a procedure for any corporation, any company, any entity to apply to basically sort of legally throw up their hands and commit the property to, the affairs of the property to the district court under state statutory law, which in this case provides that such an entity, if the court finds that the factual basis exists, should be put in, if you will, receivership, and a receiver or custodian appointed to take effective control of the assets, the liabilities, and attempt to rehabilitate the entity. That's my job. I drew the short straw, and actually I shouldn't make light of it. I was asked to consider taking the job of custodian, receiver, executor, technically custodian again, to try to find, to try to reverse this march to insolvency, march to bankruptcy, which I've just described. And so I agreed to take on the job, and I've been at it for about a year. I have a couple of folks who are helping me, particularly a woman named Debbie Van Son, who some of you may have heard of. Debbie was the assistant city manager for the city of Lawrence for a number of years, and then she became the second-ranking person at this at the KU Athletic Department. I just bring that up because Debbie has as much or more experience in trying to solve puzzles like this than I do. So we've been at it for now more than a year. And it became clear, the first thing we did was try to figure out, was there a way to operate, to do that which the prior boards had failed, and to operate this entity financially as an events rental venue. I can tell you that our conclusion was no, for a variety of reasons. Glad to answer questions about that. So then we realized this march to bankruptcy and solvency will not stop unless we can find some other use for this property, which is compatible with the neighborhood, which is consistent with the philosophy of land use laws, and which provides for sufficient revenue to pay the ongoing expenses. So that's what we've been up to. And we realized in order to do that, we needed to expose this property to the market. That is, to let people know that if you have an interest in Castle Tea Room and operating it, please let us know. And so we entered into 6 months plus ago a listing agreement with a commercial real estate firm that is only for lease, by the way. It is not, we are not at a point where we will consider offers to purchase the property because of what I said before, that it is apparently the intention of Libby that this not fall into totally private hands, and some use be found to do what we need to stop this march toward insolvency. So in talking with the realtor and thinking logically, we thought, well, we don't know what lessee might be out there, but we do know this, that the only possible use under the existing SUP was for that which had failed and which we thought had no future. So we had several meetings with Kyle and the planning department, and we appreciate their time to just brainstorm through what other uses are in the code that might fit this definition of being able to possibly entice a lessee and do that in a way which is financially positive toward keeping this property. We came up with this list of uses, frankly. There's a lot of things that are not in there. There's some which, of course, the commission may find concerning or questionable. We hope not. We tried to identify a list of possible uses that had some utility to possible lessees and which would be relatively consistent with the past uses. So we didn't include a number of things. I can't tell you today what use someone will come to us about that that we might find is consistent with Libby's desires and the community's needs. We just last week, for the first time, received two, in fact, letters of intent, and I won't go into those right now, but after 6 months of having no one give us any indication that they had any interest in leasing the property, we now have a flicker of possible uses. Whether either of those work out for us and for the potential lessee, I don't know. So bottom line, we're here to attempt to stop this march toward insolvency of this non-for-profit foundation, to do that in a way which will preserve the intention of Libby, and importantly, of course, to preserve this property and allow the maintenance to be done on the property that will keep it from crumbling over the years, and to allow some semblance of public usage for the property.
Thank you. I'm sure there were going to be questions, but at this time we're going to open the floor for public comment. Any members of the public that wish to comment on this item, please come up to the podium. I see no public comment. One.
Hi, I am Teresa Brown, and I own the house, let's see, on 1301 Vermont. And I remember Libby. We used to have dinners there. My husband belonged to this literary society called the Belloc Society, and I appreciate your time and everything that you're doing to put effort that you're putting into this. And I was just reading the list of ideas that was in the letter. One of them was bed and breakfast, elder hostel. Anyway, there's a list of ideas. But one idea that I had that I was going to put out was a cafe for maybe part of the money goes to take care of the building, and part would go to local charities. Like, I forget what they call these organizations, but there's a term for it where you know, like 20 or 30% of the money, 50% of the money goes to the building and the rest goes to some charity. There's so many local charities that, and I have no idea how it would go, or, you know, like, I know that like for a small events, it's not a good building, like you said, it hasn't worked, so that's just one idea that I had. And maybe offices could be in the top part, but I know there's a full kitchen in the bottom, right?
Not so much.
Oh, not so much?
No.
Okay.
They did it, as well, no.
Okay, I thought they did the catering, like the Marcelli's had set it at the bottom part, I remember going through. Is it not
We'll
really a full
clarify
kitchen?
that, but thank you
Okay.
very much.
Okay.
Any other members of the public? Last chance. All right, seeing none, we'll bring it back up to the commission. Anyone want to start with some questions or comments? Commissioner Willie.
Kyle, can I ask? So, and this kind of to Ms. Brown's point, is this an exhaustive list of the things that are being considered for this property? If there's anything that comes outside of this list, would it then have to come back to us?
Any additions to the list that you have in front of you would require restarting this process over again. So application, HRC, Planning Commission, City Commission.
Okay. And just to follow up, kind of related, this adaptive reuse for historic properties, and that's called for in the comp plan. This is the first that we've seen for some time. Is that right?
To my knowledge, the last one that came through was the previous one on this site.
Oh,
So
okay.
that gives you some perspective on the time frame.
Thank you.
Commissioner Sands.
Question for Kyle as well. The HRC's decision was that it didn't damage the environs, or I'm trying to find the specific wording. Destroy historic property included, et cetera, et cetera. Did they, what I can't find is if they considered the specific uses that were being proposed or as part of the application, or they said because there's no change in the structure, then it's fine?
They didn't really provide specific comments
Regarding
in
use.
those regards. They
Okay.
were, in the presentation they were given, they were told essentially the same thing, that this application is for the uses, and there is
Right.
no change proposed for the site. So that's really all they had to evaluate.
Okay.
Their role is to evaluate those elements of it.
Right.
And, they basically found that, it was appropriate given the guidelines that they had to work with.
Commissioner Willie.
So I have one more. You mentioned, Kyle, that the parking would be set later once the use is known.
So I might have misspoke.
Okay.
The parking that's in place on the site right now, like if you walk down there tonight,
Mhm.
is the parking that will be in place regardless of which use goes onto the property. So
Okay.
whatever combination or single use you see that they propose, the same parking will stay in place. And the reason for that is so if one use goes in that requires a little bit more parking, they don't modify the site for that, and then a few years later, something else goes in and they remove a bunch of, to remove those changes to the site
Okay.
that might come about otherwise.
Thank you.
Follow-up to that. I did write down your phrase "frozen in place." Is that something that should be under the conditions, that the parking will remain as it is?
We could add it to the conditions. We have it on the plan itself right now, which is why I didn't have it on the conditions. I could add it to that list, but since in our discussion with the applicant, that was one of the first things that we discussed, and that was one of the first notes that we had put on that plan itself. So we just chose to have it live there, at least for the time being.
Well, just speaking for me, my preference would be that it be listed as possibly number 8, just so it's clear when it goes up to the city commission that that's been considered. Any other questions or comments? Any motions?
I would just say that I hope that whatever happens to the Castle Tea Room, it continues to stay in operation. My wife has a dream that when I become the Adjutant General of Kansas, that my promotion ceremony is there. I'd hate to have to break her heart by telling her that we'll have to move the promotion ceremony. I'm kidding, I'm not going to be the Adjutant General. But I don't see any red flags with this. My concern, I think, was on parking, and, you know, the parking standards are likely going to change, and what's there is what's there, and there's some off-street parking, so I think even with several different uses on site, parking will not be able to be fixed or not fixed because it's what is there. So if, sorry.
Please, go ahead.
Did you have a question? Oh, so I was going to go into a motion.
Yeah, I do have, I just have a comment, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
So I just want to say thank you for the history of the property. I wasn't that familiar with it. It's really good to have that when we're making our decisions. And I think there are so many regulatory agencies involved in a historic property like this that I'm reasonably comfortable that the building itself and the environs there are not going to change. And I'd much rather see an adaptive reuse than a demolition by neglect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And whatever gets access to the citizens of Lawrence and Douglas County that is open to so that people can appreciate the history of it.
I'd just like to add that when it comes to this, or especially when you add in the history, so I'm happy that we're finding a way that we can keep that structure here, as Commissioner Weaver says, so we don't end up with an unfortunate situation of demolition by neglect down the road. So all my best wishes. I hope it does work well. Commissioner Sinclair.
Can I ask one question? I know short-term rentals are kind of in flux now, maybe, but if under this adaptive reuse, one of the permitted uses is short-term rental, is that going to be, if something changes in terms of the code and what we're allowing on short-term rentals, will that just automatically apply to this use? It'll just kind of be subsumed?
It's a use today, and we're proposing for it to be a use through our other process. So we're pretty confident that it will remain a use in the development code and is fitting as a use in this list.
Any motions?
I'd like to make a motion to recommend approval of SUP 19-00389, a special use permit for the adaptive reuse of designated historic property to allow detached dwelling, home occupation type A and B, work live unit, congregate living, cultural center, library, small event center, private dining establishment, administrative professional office, financial insurance and real estate office, other, and bed and breakfast, elder hostel, or short-term rental at 1307 Massachusetts Street, and forward that to the City Commission with a recommendation for approval based upon the findings of fact presented in the body of the staff report and subject to conditions 1 through 7. And did we talk about adding a further condition?
We should talk about that if you want to add it.
Yeah, let's talk about that last condition, and I might amend my motion. Well, so moved, so.
Okay.
Discussion on the motion, I guess.
Well, let's have discussion on that motion.
Okay.
Someone needs to second the motion first.
You're correct. Do we have a second? Second. Okay, now discussion on the motion. Do we want to add a number 8 about just to make the parking specific in the list of criteria?
It was your question about the parking. Do you want to?
I'm comfortable either way. I think it's already mentioned in the plan. It's already been agreed to by the applicant. Is that correct? I think it gives it a little clarity since, well, obviously, I had questions about it. So I'm comfortable with it being there as a condition number 8 or not.
I guess I would say that I don't see, in my comments earlier, I don't see where you can accommodate more parking, so I would hate to see that an efficient and effective use of the building as a whole for multiple uses be restricted because it doesn't meet minimum parking standards. So there's some shared off-street, there's 2 handicap spots that I can count, maybe 1 for deliveries and 2 others. And I guess maybe I have a question for the applicant. There's a shared Well, there's a angle-in parking lot on the back side between Vermont Street and Massachusetts Street. I'm assuming that's probably not for service for the Castle building, or is it?
I have the disadvantage of not looking at exactly what you're looking
I'm sorry.
at. But
I can.
There's straight-in parking on the alley, I guess it's alley. Kyle, help me, right behind to the west of the castle.
Right.
And I think there's technically something like 7 or 8 spots there. So as long as I'm up here, I think that we don't object if the same language that exists now about the parking being frozen, that is, that we can't reduce any of the parking, we're fine with that. What I would be cautious about and concerned about is sort of technically to make sure that whatever new language goes in there as condition 8 isn't somehow interpreted to make it more difficult for us to find a use. Because as I said before, we don't know who's going to come to us with what use. And it might be that somebody comes to us with a great use which is not on this list. And if that's the case, then we'll have to come back and start the process over. So I don't, as long as we're not unwittingly making it more difficult for us or taking away some parking, I don't really care. But I also agree that it seems like it's sort of duplicative, belts and suspenders to say the same thing over again. But if the commission decides to do that, we'll work in that environment.
The parking lot to the west, I assume that's probably not public parking.
I'm having cataract surgery on Monday, so. Where the shadows are?
Yes, sir.
On the west side of the alley,
Angle parking.
completely across the.
That belongs to the nursing home, the funeral home.
I see.
The
Okay.
mortuary. There was in place when Larry McElwain owned it, a verbal agreement between he and Libby that when she was operating it as a restaurant and whatever else, that her guests could use that. It never was put in writing, so that can't be regarded as available for this use or any possible future use unless we go back and actually get that. So, long way of saying that property that I think you're looking at is not part of the parking on this parcel.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Hey, this is getting more complicated than it probably should be. Any other comments, discussion?
I would just say, based on that, I would personally suggest leaving it out of the conditions. Just
Okay.
leaving it as is.
So we have a motion on the table that's been seconded that does not have that in it. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Passes 10-0. Thank you.
Thank you all.
And good luck. Brings us to the end of tonight's agenda, unless we have anything from staff that we need to consider between now and Wednesday.
There was one miscellaneous item added, apparently, that I didn't see until I opened up my program tonight. That is an invitation to you, which I am very grateful for, that we're holding on November 1st, Friday, from 3 to 5, a little farewell for me and staff to cry our goodbyes to each other, at least I will. And so please note that, and also note that after 5 p.m. we'll be retiring to Johnny's in North Lawrence for some more farewell. So hope you can join me and others for both of those occasions.
Thank you. Any other items for this evening? Seeing none, do I have a motion to recess our meeting until Wednesday, October 23rd at 6:30? Moved by Commissioner Carter. Have a second? Second by Commissioner Sinclair. All those in favor of recessing? 10-0. Done.